Hello, Geography 232 students. Welcome to week 3. This week we'll be talking about image classification. So once again, as I mentioned in the past, make sure that you watch the lecture video or go through the lecture notes before proceeding with the lab, and try to at least take a stab at the lab before our time together on Zoom. So without any other preamble, let's get started. So this week's lecture, as I said, is image classification. Your lab is called Calculate Impervious Surfaces from Spectral Imagery, and essentially what you'll be doing is image classification. So you're going to be taking an aerial image with multiple bands, and from that you'll be classifying the various pixel values, reclassifying the pixel values, so you can get an idea how much of the surface area is occupied by what types of surfaces, pervious versus impervious. So an impervious surface would be something like concrete, like asphalt, sidewalk, road, things like that, whereas pervious would be grass, things where water can trickle down through. So upon completion of this lecture and lab, you should know how to understand and perform supervised classification of imagery, create training samples, I'll explain what those are in a bit, decide which classification methods apply, and use classification to make recommendations. So one of the points I always try to drive home in my classes is that raw data, it's just data. The goal of GIS is to convert data into information. All right, and so classification is one way to take raw data, convert it, do some sort of manipulation, and pull out information. In this case, the information is what percentage of a neighborhood is pervious to water. Outline. So what is image classification? Why classify imagery? Supervised classification methods versus unsupervised classification methods. Those are two different ways to classify imagery. All right, so what is image classification? Classification, it's a verb to classify. It's the act or process of categorizing things according to shared qualities or characteristics. So I like to use the example of animal classification. So essentially we do this in a sort of stratification system. Okay, so we categorize animals based off of shared characteristics. As the specificity increases, grouping sets get smaller. So at the highest level, we have the kingdoms, right? So animal kingdom. Below that, we have phylum, then class, order, family, genus, all the way down to species. So the broad land cover categories to smaller categories could be, in this example here, something like forest would be at the higher level. Then you drill down even farther, and it might be certain types of forest, like deciduous, evergreen, or mixed forest. All right, so it's the same kind of idea. So you're classifying land cover types by some sort of similarity. But once you've classified one group, you might be able to classify them even more narrowly. Okay. So this image should be familiar to you now. The image classification includes the processes and methods for converting imagery into information. By employing the big 8 elements of imagery interpretation to make sense of imagery, you've already applied manual image classification. I call it manual because you do it essentially by hand or by your own eye. Okay, so in any case, it's about making sense of the pixels on screen. So whether you use a GIS-based classification method or you use the elements of image interpretation, either way, you're taking raw data, in this case, pixels in an image, and making sense of them, trying to classify them, trying to group them into logical categories, and then from there, trying to decide something about the landscape. You know, in this image of Disneyland, we could say, you know, what percentage of the landscape is pervious versus impervious? Well, in that case, we'd want to use some sort of a computer-based classification method. If, on the other hand, we want to use a manual method, we could say what portion of Disneyland is covered by man-made structures. And it's fairly easy to tell. Obviously, all of Disneyland's man-made, but you could say which portion of buildings have a round roof, which portion of buildings have a rectangular roof, what portion of the landscape is water, what is asphalt, what are trees. So those types of classes you can more or less figure out with the naked eye. When it comes down to actual surface types, like pervious versus impervious, that's when we need to rely more on a computer-based method. So beyond manual and subjective image interpretation, image classification includes automated methods for assigning meaning to pixels. Rather than applying the elements of image interpretation to imagery, we use computer algorithms to find patterns and make sense of raw data. So as I talked about last week, different items on the surface have a different spectral signature. And so GIS is very acutely able to classify or recognize different signatures along the electromagnetic spectrum, and then you can choose to group them together. Those that have some sort of similarity, maybe in the actual hue, or maybe the pattern, something like that. Something like that. Automated classification techniques classify pixels into groups, or what we call classes, when they are spatially adjacent, meaning nearby to one another, maybe sharing a border, or spectrally similar. So they might have the same color or have the same texture. So there are two key factors involved in classification, both the location and the proximity to one another, and a shared characteristic in the form of a color or texture. Because you could have two similarly colored objects, but if they're nowhere near each other, then there's a lower likelihood that they are related to one another. But sometimes they are. They could be two different bodies of water. They're both water, but they're not necessarily connected. There are three main image classification techniques: unsupervised, supervised, and object-based. Unsupervised and supervised techniques date back to the 1970s, sort of in the early proto-era of GIS. Object-based methods are newer, and they rely on high-resolution imagery. So without high-resolution imagery, object-based classification is not possible. Methods rely on algorithms to translate and make sense of pixel values. The classification methods group data into classes with similar characteristics, as I said, proximity to one another, and shared signature along the electromagnetic spectrum. Algorithms are highly varied in range from a simple rule set, like must be the same band along the electromagnetic spectrum, or a more sophisticated statistical technique, like a couple of the methods I talked about last week, or still some new and developing machine learning methods, which we'll actually get into over the next couple of weeks in class. So why do we classify images? What's the goal? What is the purpose of image classification? Well, we classify imagery to make sense of the landscape. Classification divides a landscape into logical categories or classes. Some examples of classes might be urban, water, or vegetation. Those would be very high level. And as I mentioned before, you could take urban and divide that into roads, driveways, sidewalks, buildings, things like that. Water could be creeks, rivers, lakes, ocean, and vegetation could be broad spectrum. Grasses could be healthy grass, could be dead grass, could be agricultural land, could be fallow agriculture, could be active, healthy agriculture, could be trees, could be pine trees, could be broadleaf trees, and so on and so forth. So those are very high level categories, but going back to the classification systems, you can drill down farther and farther. So classification helps capture variation, the variance among and within land cover types. So consider the range of greens between 0.52 and 0.6 micrometers. So along the electromagnetic spectrum, green occupies 0.52 to 0.6 micrometers, but even within that band, there's quite a bit of variation, okay? And it's the same thing for reds and blues as well. So a few real-world applications. Classification helps summarize dominant landscape forms and provide context for land use planning, vegetation monitoring, climate meteorology, conservation, and research projects. So at its most simplistic application, image classification helps us see what exists on the ground. And then beyond that, we can compare what exists today to what existed at some point in the past. We could take a snapshot of today and look back on today in the future and compare future values. So image classification helps us basically assign a numerical value to the state of the surface based off of its spectral signature. So what's the basic strategy? The basic strategy is capturing variation. So different objects have different spectral signatures. Land cover types reflect incoming solar radiation differently. For example, grass reflects a spectral signature like the color green because chlorophyll A absorbs light within the violet, blue, and red wavelengths while mainly reflecting green. This reflectance gives chlorophyll its green appearance. So we're looking at similarities on the landscape and differences on the landscape. And going back to the example of the 0.52 to 0.6 micrometers, there's still quite a bit of variation in there. So image classification allows us to capture all of the greens within that band and call them vegetation, or select certain segments of that band and say, these are pine trees, these are broadleaf trees, things like that. So it allows us to essentially group things together. Among different vegetation types, there is a variety of spectral signatures. low grass, tall grass, deciduous trees, coniferous trees, wetlands, and so on, and they all have different spectral signatures. Within a single vegetation type, there is a variety of spectral signatures, as I said before, between 0.52 and 0.6, and the same applies to blue from 0.45 to 0.52, red 0.63 to 0.69, near infrared, shortwave infrared, thermal, shortwave infrared 1 and 2. They all have different spectral signatures, and they all occupy a rough area along the electromagnetic spectrum, not a specific point, not a finite point, but a little wider point than one single location. So it's about capturing the variations within those bands. So we also classify to capture variability. So think of a pixel's reflectance in 2D space, meaning on a surface, on a plane. The pixel occupies a point in that specific space. And so our example here will be a leaf on a maple tree. In a Landsat scene, instead of only 2 dimensions, X and Y, we actually could have 6 or more spectral layers, and those we'll think of those as dimensions in this case. It's not just the RGB values of that maple leaf, the color that you see, which in fall may be kind of a reddish brown color, in spring it may be a green color, but it's also the near infrared signature, the middle infrared, the far infrared, and the thermal. Okay, so essentially each one of those different sensors captures a different signature along the electromagnetic spectrum. Each pixel represents a point in 6-dimensional space. So a single point in space, but with essentially six different perspectives on that single pixel. With this variability, the vegetation pixel occupies a region, not a point, of n-dimensional space. So maybe it's 6 dimensions, maybe it's 5, 4, as few as 3. So RGB and infrared will sense the point a bit differently from one another. So essentially they occupy a specific region, but not a single point, because again, these are multiple sensors and they identify different bands along the electromagnetic spectrum. So to deal with this variability, we classify regions into clusters. We delineate the boundaries of classes in n-dimensional space, maybe 4 dimensions, 5, 6, depending on the number of bands, and then we assign class names to pixels in those regional boundaries. So all the pixels in one particular boundary may be called green. Another set of pixels, another cluster of pixels may be called red, or they may represent healthy trees, we'll say like in spring. Another might be unhealthy trees, right? So they're going to represent different objects on the surface. Classification methods. So as I mentioned before, there are 3 main classification techniques: unsupervised, supervised, and object-based. As I said before, unsupervised and supervised are the oldest techniques, and object-based is a newer sort of emergent technique. And determining the method depends on the spatial resolution of the raster data that you are working with, the manual effort necessary to classify the data, and the spatial extent of the study area. Each of those has an effect on what method you choose. I would also add to that I guess this is going under the category of manual effort, but the amount of time you intend to run the classification, because some of these techniques are very fast, others are a bit slower. All right, so let's get into unsupervised classification first. Unsupervised classification uses statistical clustering algorithms to sample values of pixels within an image and group similar samples into clusters or buckets. So the key thing I want you to take away from this is the term statistical clustering algorithms. Essentially, with unsupervised classification, you're trusting the computer to make the decisions for you without any sort of oversight, hence the name unsupervised. So more or less the various statistical methods, and there are multiple statistical methods, it's not just one, will look at the pixels and then make a determination based on the spectral signature and the proximity to one another, which bucket or cluster to put the pixels into. So we have an example here on the left, which is supposed to be an actual original image of, we'll say, an island, and on the right is the cluster map. So this is where the pixels have been clustered into. And you can see, if you can see this chart here, you've got the different clusters 1 through 15, and the number of pixels that have been plugged in each one of these clusters. So right here, cluster 6, this is what we'd be calling an outlier, because there's only one single pixel that falls into that area. And so just be aware of that. Essentially, you are trusting the computer algorithms to bucketize the pixels for you. Cluster calculations are performed on cells, pixels, in multivariate attribute space. So the band values are analyzed not only based on the spatial location, proximity to one another, and also based on the spatial context, so the similarity of nearby pixels. So it's not just about where the pixels are, but how similar they are in a nearby relationship. What are some methods of unsupervised classification? Well, we have k-means. All right, so k-means, the analyst specifies the desired number of clusters. An image is sampled and each pixel placed into clusters based on Euclidean distance from the multivariate mean vector. Once all pixels have been placed into clusters, cluster means are recalculated based on the new multivariate mean vector, and the process repeats a user-defined number of times until each of the pixels have been properly bucketized. And you do not need to memorize these, but just these are more for your reference in the future. So k-means, ISO data, and ISO data stands for Iterative Self-Organizing Data Analysis Technique, and I add something for the A at the end, yay. Similar to k-means, except that the number of clusters is allowed to vary from iteration to iteration based on a user-defined measurement. If the distance between two clusters falls below a specific minimum, then the clusters are merged together. Conversely, if a cluster's variance exceeds the specified maximum, then the cluster is divided into two or more. And this process repeats a user-defined number of times. And here is an example of unsupervised classification, pre and post-processed. So I'll go back and forth a couple of times so you can see what it looks like. This is the raw imagery, and this is the classified imagery. So I'll point out here, you can see there are some greenery. You can see some kind of like green belts. You can see some water. You can see a lot of urbanized landscape. So keep those types in mind. Then we go forward. The green belts are more or less green and yellow. So that would be forest and cropland. The water is blue. And the developed land is sort of this pinkish gray color. And so obviously the vast majority in this image is developed. So that's what classification does on a very simple level. So what are the pros and cons of unsupervised classification? Well, the advantages are that detailed knowledge of an area is not required. You can take an image of anywhere in the world and run unsupervised classification on it. And because you're trusting the algorithms to look at the spectral signature and the proximity of like pixels to one another, it doesn't matter whether you have had any sort of first-hand experience on the ground there. You don't necessarily need to ground truth. So the classes are distinct units and represent the entire range of variation in the cluster data. Disadvantages, the spectral classes do not necessarily correspond with the real world. Because there's not that ground truthing or that first-hand experience on the ground, you are trusting that the output is accurate, and it may not necessarily be. And lastly, the disadvantage, analysts must specify several parameters, including the number of clusters. So there is some manual labor involved, but much less so than supervised, which we will now get into. Supervised classification. So in supervised classification, the GIS user guides the classification process by providing representative samples, which we call training samples or training sites for each predefined class. Supervised, in this case, mimics the process of image interpretation. So this introduces a certain human variable, which has pros and cons. But the pros here that just as the interpreter uses the trained eye to recognize the characteristics on the landscape, so too must the computer algorithm be trained to recognize classes. So these training samples or training sites, essentially what you are doing as the analyst is you are actually selecting specific locations on an aerial image, and you are telling the computer this specific point represents a road. This specific location represents a tree. So in my example here, this is an area of known conifer trees. This is an area of known water. This is an area of known deciduous trees, and so on and so forth. So you're actually telling the computer algorithm what to look for. So the pixels that share this spectral signature are X, Y, and Z land cover types. So supervised classification relies on the interpreter's knowledge of the area to supervise or train the classification process. So there is a human element in supervised classification that is not present in unsupervised, which obviously opens up a certain margin for error if the user is not explicit with what examples represent which real-life features, but it also allows the algorithm to have some sort of training or some sort of direction instead of I was going to say haphazardly, not haphazardly, but purely relying on algorithms versus actually having some sort of known variables introduced. So some examples, you would visually identify coniferous forest and assign them to a conifer class. Likewise, visually identify a lake and assign it to water, or visually identify building rooftops and parking lots and assign those to urban. So you literally would draw a little box or a little circle around a rooftop and say, this is a roof, and then all other rooftops that share that spectral signature within a range will then be classified as roof. It's a very, very cool system, and it happens to be what you will be practicing in the lab this week. So training sites, what are those? Those are sample areas of known land cover type, and we call them training sites. The rigor of examination may range from viewing aerial imagery to ground truthing and sampling. So you could just have an aerial image without any firsthand knowledge of the area, but you can clearly recognize this is grass, this is urban landscape, this is water, and then you still tell the supervised classification algorithm that this is tree, grass, and water. So care must be taken to accurately attribute training sites to the land cover types that they represent. And that will be kind of drilled home in the lab as well. Make sure that when you actually draw little circles or squares or polygons around the training sites that you are accurate. You want to make sure that you only include pixels that represent a specific training site and not anything else. So if you're drawing a circle in the example of my image here on the right, if you're to draw a circle kind of halfway in the water and halfway in the grass, that would confuse the algorithm. So you have to be careful. Incorrect attribution leads to a higher margin of error in classification. So the more spectrally different land cover types are, the easier it is to select effective training sites. So water and forest and developed land are clearly different, have clearly different spectral signatures. Also high versus low albedo land cover. So if you had snow versus rock, or say grass versus water, one has a higher albedo, and albedo is just reflectance. As classes become more spectrally similar, it becomes more important to take subtle differences into account. So imagine, for example, a golf course next to a park and a forest. So they're all green, right? They're all different shades of green. I actually happen to have such an example right here. So here we have a golf course. We have some grasses in the sort of the northwest corner that are not part of the golf course, and then it's surrounded by forest, right? So they're all different types of green. So you have to make sure that you are very particular in the training sites that you create, because the algorithms can tell the difference. These do have distinctly different spectral signatures, but you have to be, as the supervisor, you have to be explicit in your selection method. So there's the raw image, and here's the classification. So notice that we obviously have resolution issues going on here. The resolution of the aerial image is much higher than the classification method here. But just know that generally speaking, the yellow represents like ag land or grass. All right, so not part of the fairways of the golf course. The light green represents fairways, and the dark green represents forests. So that more or less jives. Oh, then you also have the gray. There aren't too many, but gray represents urban or developed roads in this case. All right, so here are some actual examples of training sites. You literally will say on the right-hand side, you select water. You have to create the training site first, but you select water, and then you draw a little polygon within the water. So there's water. Up on the left would be forested area. And then just immediately to the east is planted or cultivated agricultural land. So these would all be training samples. Here are some more training site areas here. All right, so if we were trying to identify commercial, this obviously would be within the broader category of urban, but we'll say the subcategory is commercial or industrial. We would draw rectangles over these rooftops. Residential, we would select the residential areas. Water, cultivated land, and notice how it has a kind of a deeper red. That it means that it's a healthier grass versus the grasses to the south, so that tells us it's irrigated. Uncultivated land, so still ag land but uncultivated, and forest. So once training site selection is complete, a signature file may be generated to contain and share training site data. So if you go through a very arduous classification process, you can save what's called a signature file. It's a .ecd extension in Arc Pro, and then it can be shared with others who might be classifying similar imagery. Okay, so the signature file allows for additional and future classifications using the same training sites, and output classifier definition file is the .ecd and that would be that's the ArcGIS Pro extension. All right, so what are some methods for supervised classification? Well, we have 5 main ones that you'll see in ArcGIS Pro. In this week's lab, you're going to rely on support vector machine. We'll just talk briefly about a couple of these. So maximum likelihood, parallel piped, minimum distance, random trees, and then support vector machine. So what are the advantages of supervised classification? You have a greater degree of control over classes than unsupervised because it actually takes the human variable into account, right? So it takes someone's firsthand experience, maybe actually in the real world doing ground truthing, or at least having that, ability to recognize, what land cover types are with the human eye, and then sharing that information, training the algorithm to identify similar spectral signatures. So greater degree of control over the classes than unsupervised. The creation of a signature file allows for sharing of training sites and classes for additional or future classification. Excuse me. The disadvantages. Disadvantages would be a detailed prior knowledge of the area is recommended, or significant element of imagery interpretation of the area. So either knowing what it's like on the ground or having just a familiarity with those types of land cover types that you'd see in the image, that would be required for this form of classification. So it actually, in order to introduce a human variable, you need to be introducing more information than the unsupervised algorithms could glean themselves, okay? And a sufficient number of training sites must be collected to achieve a high accuracy. And you'll find that out in this week's lab, that you have to collect a significant number of training sites. It's not just 1 or 2. You might need 6, 7, 8, depending on the area. And then if you multiply that by the number of ground cover classes, it can be a little time consuming, right? Your hand might get a little tired with the mouse. So just be aware of that. So there are some disadvantages as well as advantages. So quick summary of image classification. Unsupervised and supervised classification methods have their own pros and cons. Unsupervised relies heavily on computer algorithms to apply meaning to the imagery. The margin of error comes from a lack of user input. So you're trusting the algorithms to make the decisions on its own. Okay. Supervised relies on a combination of user definitions and algorithms. The margin of error in this case comes from user misattribution of land cover types. So by introducing that human factor, you are also introducing human error, which is always present, right? So just be aware of that. And then I have a little chart there to kind of break it down. We'll get into object-based next week. All right, so on that note, have a great week. Good luck on your labs, and reach out if you have questions. Have a good one. Bye-bye.